Hello everyone, now let us see the anatomy of urinary system, part 4. In the current session, we will be discussing about ureter, urinary bladder and urethra. First of all, coming to ureter. Each of the two ureters transport urine from the renal pelvis of one kidney to the urinary bladder. And peristatic contractions of the muscular walls of the ureter push the urine towards the urinary bladder, but the hydrostatic pressure and gravity also contribute. The peristatic waves that pass from the renal pelvis to the urinary bladder vary in frequency from 1 to 5 per minute depending upon how fast urine is being formed. Ureters are 25 to 30 centimeters long and are thick-walled, narrow tubes that vary in diameter from 1 mm to 10 mm along their course between the renal pelvis and the urinary bladder. Like the kidneys, ureters are retroperitoneal. Three layers of the tissue form the wall of the ureters. The deepest coat is the mucosa, which is a mucous membrane with transitional epithelium and an underlying lamina propria of the alveolar connective tissue with considerable collagen, elastic fibers and lymphatic tissue. The transitional epithelium is able to stretch a marked advantage for any organ that must accommodate a variable volume of fluid. And mucus secreted by the goblet cells of the mucosa prevents the cells from coming in contact with the urine. Here you can see these are the ureters that transport urine from kidneys to the urinary bladder. This is the urinary bladder. When empty, the urinary bladder looks like a deflated balloon. As it fills, it becomes round and then pear-shaped. The bladder holds an average of 700 to 800 ml of urine. And these are the rugae of the mucosa that allow the expansion of urinary bladder as it fills. And this is the dexterous muscle, it contracts to push urine into urethra. This is the internal orifice and this is the trigone area. And these are the urethra. This is the urinary bladder and this is the urethra passageway for discharge of urine from the body. And this is the hip bone or pubis. This thing is the external urethral splinter in the deep muscles of perineum that voluntarily controls opening and closing of the urethra. And this is the internal urethral splinter involuntarily controls opening and closing of the urethra. And this is the external urethral orifice or opening of urethra to outside. Throughout most of the length of the ureters, the intermediate coat, the muscularis, is composed of inner longitudinal and outer circular layers of smooth muscle fibers. This arrangement is opposite to that of the gastrointestinal tract, which contains inner circular and outer longitudinal layers. The muscularis of the distal third of the ureters also contains an outer layer of longitudinal muscle fibers. Thus, the muscularis in the distal third of the ureter is inner longitudinal, middle circular and outer longitudinal. And the major function of muscularis is peristalsis. And the superficial coat of ureters is the adventia. This is the third layer, superficial coat. A layer of alveolar connective tissue containing blood vessels, lymphatic vessels and nerves that serve the muscularis and mucosa. The adventia bends in the surrounding connective tissue and anchors the ureters in place. Now coming to urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is a hollow, distensible muscular organ situated in the pelvic cavity posterior to pubis symphysis. In males, it is directly anterior to rectum and in females it is anterior to vagina and inferior to uterus. The folds of the peritoneum holds the urinary bladder in the position. Folds of the peritoneum hold the urinary bladder in the position. When slightly distended due to the accumulation of urine, the urinary bladder is spherical. When it empties, it collapses. And as the urine volume increases, it becomes pear-shaped and rises into the abdominal cavity. The urinary bladder capacity averages 700 to 800 ml of urine. It is smaller in females because of the uterus occupies the space just superior to urinary bladder. Urinary bladder is generally smaller in females because the uterus occupies the space just superior to the urinary bladder. Now coming to the anatomy and histology of the urinary bladder. In the floor of the urinary bladder is a small triangular area. Floor of the urinary bladder is a small triangular area called as trigone. The two posterior corners of the trigone contain the two urethral openings. Posterior corners of the trigone contain two urethral openings. The openings into the urethra. The inner urethral orifice lies in the anterior corner. Because its mucosa is firmly bound to muscularis, the trigone has a smooth appearance. Three coats make up the wall of the urinary bladder. The deepest is the mucosa, a mucous membrane composed of transitional epithelium and an underlying lamina propria similar to that of the ureters. The transitional epithelium permits the stretching, as we have discussed earlier. Similar to ureters, urinary bladder is made up of three layers. The deepest is the mucosa. Rugae are also present to permit expansion of the urinary bladder. Rugae are nothing but the folds of the mucosa. They are present to permit the expansion of the urinary bladder. Surrounding the mucosa is the intermediate muscularis, also called as dextrosor muscle. Dextrosor muscle. Dextrosor means to push down. It consists of three layers of smooth muscle fibers, inner longitudinal, middle circular and outer longitudinal layers. Around the opening to the urethra, the circular fibers form an internal urethral splinter. Inferior to it is the external urethral splinter, which is composed of skeletal muscle and is a modification of deep muscles of the peritoneum. The most superficial coat of the urinary bladder on the posterior and inferior surfaces is adventia, a layer of alveolar connective tissue that is continuous with that of the ureters. Over the superior surface of the urinary bladder is the serosa, a layer of visceral peritoneum. Now coming to micturition reflex. The discharge of urine from the urinary bladder is called as micturition, which is also known as urination or voiding. The micturition occurs via a combination of involuntary and voluntary muscle contractions. When the volume of the urine in the urinary bladder exceeds 200 to 400 ml, pressure within the bladder increases considerably and stretch receptors in its wall transmit nerve impulses into the spinal cord. These impulses propagate to the micturition center in the sacral spinal cord segments S2 and S3 and trigger a spinal reflex called as micturition reflex. In this reflex arc, parasympathetic impulses from the micturition center propagate to the urinary bladder wall and internal urethral splinter. The nerve impulses cause contraction of the dextrosor muscle and relaxation of the internal urethral splinter. The nerve impulses cause contraction of the detrusor muscle and relaxation of the internal urethral splinter. Simultaneously, micturition center inhibits somatic motor neurons that innervate the skeletal muscle in the external urethral splinter. On contraction of the urinary bladder wall and relaxation of the splinters, urination takes place. On the contraction of the urinary bladder wall and relaxation of these external and internal splinters, the urination takes place. The urinary bladder filling causes a sensation of fullness that initiates a conscious desire to urinate before the micturition reflex actually occurs. Although emptying of the urinary bladder is a reflex, in early childhood, we learn to initiate it and stop it voluntarily. Through learned control of external urethral sphincter muscle and certain muscles of the pelvic floor, the cerebral cortex can initiate micturition or delay its occurrence for a limited period of time. Now finally coming to urethra. Urethra is a small tube leading from the internal urethral orifice in the floor of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body. In both males and females, the urethra is the terminal portion of the urinary system and a passageway for discharging urine from the body. In males, it discharges semen as well. In males, the urethra also extends from the internal urethral orifice to the exterior, but its length and passage through the body are considerably different than in females. The male urethra first passes through the prostate, then through the deep muscles of the perineum, and finally through the penis, a distance of about 20 centimeters, that is 8 inches long. Urethra is a small tube that is leading from the internal urethral orifice in the floor of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body. The male urethra, which also contains deep mucosa and a superficial muscularis, is subdivided into three anatomical regions. The first one is prostatic urethra, next is intermediate or membranous urethra, and finally spongy urethra. The prostatic urethra passes through the prostate. The intermediate or membranous urethra, the shortest portion, passes through deep muscles of the perineum. And the spongy urethra, the longest portion, passes through the penis. The epithelium of the prostatic urethra is continuous with that of the urinary bladder and consists of transitional epithelium that becomes stratified columnar or pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium more distant. The mucosa of the intermediate urethra contains stratified columnar or pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. And the epithelium of the spongy urethra is stratified columnar or pseudo-stratified columnar except near the external urethral orifice. There it is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And the lamina propria of the male urethra is alveolar connective tissue with elastic fibers and plexus of veins. The muscularis of the prostatic urethra is composed of mostly circular smooth muscle fibers superficial to lamina propria, and these circular fibers help from the internal urethral sphincter of the urinary bladder. And the muscularis of the intermediate urethra consists of circularly arranged skeletal muscle fibers of the deep muscles of the peritoneum that help form the external urethral sphincter of the urinary bladder. The muscularis of the prostatic urethra contains circular fibers that help form the internal urethral sphincter of the urinary bladder, whereas the muscularis of the intermediate urethra help form the external urethral sphincter of the urinary bladder. The several glands and other structures associated with reproduction deliver their contents into the male urethra. The prostatic urethra contains the openings of ducts that transport secretions from the prostate and the seminal vesicles and ductus deferens or vas deferens that deliver the sperm into the urethra and provide secretions that both neutralize the acidity of the female reproductive tract and contribute to sperm motility and viability. And next are the openings of the ducts of the bulbourethral glands or corpus glands that empty into the spongy urethra. The ducts of the bulbourethral glands or corpus glands empty into the spongy urethra. Coming to female urethra. In females, the urethra lies directly posterior to the pubic symphysis and is directed obliquely, inferiorly and anteriorly and has a length of 4 centimeters. The opening of the urethra to the exterior, the external urethral orifice, is located between the clitoris and the vaginal opening. And the wall of the female urethra consists of deep mucosa and superficial muscularis. The mucosa is a mucous membrane composed of epithelium and lamina propria, that is the alveolar connective tissue with elastic fibers and plexus of veins. Near the urinary bladder, the mucosa contains transitional epithelium that is continuous with that of the urinary bladder. And near the external urethral orifice, the epithelium is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Between these areas, the mucosa contains stratified columnar or pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. And the muscularis consists of circularly arranged smooth muscle fibers and is continuous with that of the urinary bladder. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for further videos on medical coding and CPC training.